Here, there we go. Well, welcome back to, well, we're not really sure what we're calling this yet. By the time you're watching this, it will probably have a name, the OODA Loopers, the OODA Gang, Garuda here, or something like that. But this is the continuing discussions of the group into John Boyd's or Colonel John Boyd's OODA Loop, and how it can be applied in many different constructs, and to explore the fact that, as we're seeing online, it's not really a loop, it's not a closed loop or a circle, it's much more of an open system, and you can start at any point within the OODA loop structure. I'm calling it a structure now. Hey, what should I call it? What's it called really, Ben?
A thing. Let's call it a thing until we can come up with a better word.
So it's an OODA thing until we come up with a different name for it. So last time we met, we sort of ended on this really interesting idea, this really interesting concept about, does the OODA loop have to be executed really rapidly? Because when we look at the military connotations, and of course we've got at least a couple of the guys here who've got that background, we think about it making decision-making really rapidly, orientating, thinking very fastly, very quickly, acting, executing very quickly. And of course, you can start at any point. And Ponch and Ben and Chris and others will talk us through that at the appropriate time. So we started thinking, well, does it have to be rapid? Can it actually be slow? Can we still use the constructs that it described, but in a less fraught? We're not battling, you're not doing dogfights in the air anymore. In business, we don't have to think in a few seconds to avoid death. We actually now want to use it in a way to make better decision making. So that was one thing. Ben found a paper, and he'd been tweeting about this in the last week or so, talking about the OODA loop as a spiral through time. And I'm reading some notes I've written here. And there is a publication about time-based frameworks for valuing knowledge and maintaining strategic knowledge. And I'll make some links available eventually in the notes below this video when you're watching it. So I wanted to really throw that open. And Ponch, you were saying something just as we're prepping to start the video about some explanation of some time constructs around OODA. I don't know if you want to start the conversation while the folks in Australia wake up and the folks in England consume more of adult beverages.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Nigel. One of the things we did back in Quantico 2019 with the OODA Cynefin workshop was we took a look at an approach to describe the OODA loop using a slinky, so basically a spiral on a stick. And that's Lou Hayes. He did a great job explaining that. A few months later, over in Budapest, Dave and I looked at the maturing what we did in Quantico and looking at a spiral approach to the OODA loop as it goes through the Cynefin framework. Now, we didn't get a chance to draw this out. I'm not a very good artist by any stretch of the means or imagination, but just to kind of dive a little bit deeper into bigger picture here, the last briefing that John Boyd gave was called the conceptual spiral, right? So therefore, when you think about all the briefs and everything that came together over 20 plus years of him working on this, we'll call it 40 years of him working on this, there's a green book called A Discourse on Winning and Losing. And the last chapter, if you will, the last briefing, the last thing he modified, and the time we got the actual OODA loop sketch for the first time was about 1995 or 1996. I think it was 1995. And in that, he just talks about a paradigm for survival and growth, the OODA loop, and he draws his first sketch then. So you can't really do a good job in drawing this on a napkin. And like you started out off earlier, Nigel, that you see a lot of people drawn as a continuous or just one circle, and we don't want to do it that way, or we don't want to draw it that way for several reasons. But that's as far as I'm going to go as far as a spiral today. I'm not the one to speak to it. I know if we had Lou Hayes here today, he would definitely walk us through the slinky approach, which is pretty neat to see. But as anything goes through time, you definitely want to spiral through time as you do solid decision making. So I'll throw it back to you or Ben, even, Nigel.
But so just to qualify, the slink is the big spring thing we used to play with as kids that walks itself downstairs. Is that what we're talking about? Because that's
and if you if you stretch it out across the stick, it just spirals and spirals and spirals and spirals. So that's the way we want to think about the OODA loop, is we're always going through it in time.
But I want to pick up. I want to pick up before Ben jumps in on that and the other guys, because I can see they're all now itching. It's the gin that's working. But when you stretch the spiral out, it sort of can be very, very long. You've got a full size slinky.
Right.
But you said we don't want to think of OODA as a circle. Now we've had some debates online, and we know why, but a lot of people watching this don't know why. We shouldn't imagine it just as a loop like PDCA or some other loop. And when you think of a spiral, you just think of this continuous PDCA sort of loop. It's stretched out and you're sort of spiraling. So does, I don't know if you or one of the guys want, or one of the gang want to say something about why it's not a loop, you know, observe, orient, decide, act, repeat, why you can start at any point, why it's an open system, not a closed system. And while when we talk about it as a spiral, we're not reinforcing the fact that it's a circular loop. I don't know who wants to pick up on that, but anybody can.
Yeah, real fast within the OODA loop, and I might get the number wrong. I think there's actually 27 different loops within it. And it might be fewer than that. I have to do the math. But in order to go through it, you know, if you think about a flow system, you want to find the most efficient way to get through something. Same thing with the OODA loop, but it's dependent on context. So of those potential 27 pathways, we want to find the fewest, the least resistance to get through it. And that's, you know, we're going to end up spiraling as we do that through time. Now it changes based off of context, and you know from Cynefin, we all know from Cynefin framework and just general systems thinking and complex adaptive systems thinking that our context is always changing. So therefore, what we're seeing is a constant change in the potential OODA loops as we go through time. So it's again, it's very hard to draw out and explain. I'm not very good at that, but happy to throw it back to Ben or Nigel to see if they want to amplify that.
Maybe I'll take a stab. So I think the spiral becomes a little bit more useful if you think about the effect of an action, right? When you take an action, there is a delay between that action happening, the effects of that action playing out, and you know the expectation that the action sets within your orientation, right? So there's a few things I've been digging into around cognition and embodied cognition, and essentially none of our senses really work until we take an action first. So, you know, we're sitting here thinking we have a static view of the world, but actually our eyes are always moving, and we're continually moving to build this kind of static simulation that we think we have, but we've actually got, you know, very low fidelity senses that are always, you know, we grasp a glass and we don't know we're feeling a glass until we move it a little bit, right? So I think the orientation, the action feeding into orientation is what gives that. If you have the x-axis as time, right, we take an action here, but we don't sense it until we move past that point to some, you know, whatever the delay is. Now you can have very, very almost instantaneous ripples of that action where you start to realize, you know, if you're in something that you understand, like, you know, to go back on our analogy from last time, you know, if you're a very, very practiced grappler and you do something, all of the simulations about what might happen in response to that action have played out in your head already. So being able to reintegrate what you observe is very quick. If you're a strategic cycle in a business, right, you've taken an action and it's not really an action, it's a conglomeration of loads of stuff that's happened, and you've released a feature maybe. The feedback from that is going to be much longer. So then you've got these kind of nested spirals. As you move through time, you take an action and it kind of, I don't know, spiral is a good way to put it, I suppose, because you're moving through time. You take an action here and then your observation doesn't kick in until, well, let's say you take an action here, you're still moving, you realize it here, you realize something else here, you realize something else here. So I think that's where the paper that I found, which has got lots of diagrams like Boyd's diagrams that look like they've been, you know, drawn with crayon on an overhead projector. But I think that's a useful, that's one of the things I found useful when I've been digging into the kind of the cognition, the embodied cognition stuff.
There was some notes jumping up in the chat between us just to prompt things. Ponch was saying unfolding interaction within the environment or with the environment, and Chris was saying dependent on affordances, which is a great word. I've got some words you wrote. I just looked back on a Slack posting you've been writing, Ben, to find some of the things you've been sort of toying with, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But Chris, do you want to elaborate a bit on this dependent on affordances? Because that's probably a new phrase for a lot of people.
Yeah, I can do it very quickly, and then I think Kim was going to mention something, so I'll jump through that and then hand over. But So the basic idea of affordances is something that the environment is offering the agents within it, essentially, if you want to look at it that way. So a very simple example of that would be in an ecosystem, technically life would require water, and water would be something that a sustainable ecosystem would offer to the living agents within it. And with
Excellent.
that, I'll hand over.
Kim.
Cool. So I was going to come back to the it's not a closed loop bit, because as we were talking about the spiral moving through time, if you looked at it straight on, it's not going to be a perfect circle, right? It's going to have different steps in it because we've got the different pathways. So it's like a slinky that's got kinks in it. So it's actually more like a kinky.
That's funny.
I've got all sorts of comments I could make, but I'm going to choose not to do that. I don't want to get into trouble. But so now we have a kinky loop that John Boyd gave us. Who wants to pick up on that? Andrew, that's obviously perfect for you to pick up on.
Andrew appears to like kinky, so.
So actually, though, Nigel, you've got the perfect illustration sat right behind you of a helix.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not a slinky with one kink, if you want. It's a helix with multiple interconnected ones.
Helix is a very good
multiple interconnected kinks.
DNA style.
But no, I'm liking this a lot because this, I mean, we know we include it within the flow system discussion and the flow system is sort of learning, but it actually, when all of you started to explain it, and it was sort of making sense to me that the spiral represents the journey through time. But as you were describing and Kim was illustrating as well, depending on which axis you view it on, the way OODA is being executed is changing based upon what's happening within the environment and everything, or the sense making or the situational awareness within the environment. And to pick up something you were saying, and I apologize to viewers for reading this, but this is how I get it. So some of the things that you've been saying the other day, Ben, is that action sets expectation, expectation shapes observation. So actions set an expectation of effects of that action. Observations generate surprise, often more than we know. Surprise creates intention, and intention triggers action. Now, do you think that's a linear causality, or do you think any of those things can happen with some level of randomness? Because when we talk about OODA, we start at different points, but what that sounds like is a bit of a linear causality and a rinse and repeat. And that's the antithesis of what we just described.
Yeah.
Who wants to take that one,
absolutely.
Ben?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, so it's the surprise that's the key thing, right? If we've got multiple intersecting, differently scaled helixes moving through time, those are all generating input and, generating entropy, I guess is a word for it. And that surprise is something that builds up. It's like it builds up potential, right? So there's lots of little things that will happen you'll ignore, but they'll build up some potential, and then something will happen that triggers all of that potential and generates an intention, right? So that's actually really good. That means that I can take that diagram that I threw into the chat for some discussion, and I can try and make it a bit clearer that it's so this is from Surfing Uncertainty, which is about cognition and what goes on in neuroscience and the brain. So we're constantly seeking to reduce our surprise in the environment, right? We've got this with so it's free energy theory from Carl Friston. So we've got this blanket, Markov blanket around ourselves, which separates us from the environment. We have our internal structure or orientation, as we would call it. And we're continually seeking to make that match the environment as closely as we can. So when things happen that surprise us, we will act in one of two ways, or a spectrum of ways. We'll change our model. I will say, oh, this is Boyd's snowmobile. We thought we knew this, but we don't know this. And that's the kind of high energy, you stop, you consider, you really pick things apart, you destroy things and create new models. Or we can seek to change our environment by taking an action. And I think that's the link between OODA and this free energy theory that I think is really, really interesting. And I think so one of Chet Richards' blogs was insinuating that Boyd was starting to think of OODA as sort of collapsed all into the orientation loop. So almost thinking about like we're back to a circle, but a different type, where we've got observations coming in and we take actions based on some trigger. And those triggers are this kind of surprise mechanism. So I've talked a lot. I will let somebody else take over.
It's fascinating. I'm seeing Kim nodding furiously. So if you want to jump in, Kim, just jump in, because I know one of your comments, Ben, was you think it's all O. And given some of the earlier comments, let's be very careful with this, but it's all about orientation, yeah? And I've got something I'm going to throw in about hypothesis in a minute. But Kim, there was anything you wanted to add there? Because I knew you were nodding at what Ben was saying. That was pretty deep stuff, Ben.
Yeah, I was just thinking, and I want to come back to it a bit later, but the speed that we do this at, we're very good at taking an action or making a decision prematurely in the complex space. So I wanted to tie what you were saying, Ben, into the speed at which we're going through these things. Because I think it's very easy to stop and take a decision, but it's also very easy to make that decision prematurely without having done enough, observation and orientation.
Chris, did you want to add anything, or Andrew? Because I want to go in the, I just want to introduce another idea, but I don't want to lose this train of thought.
Andrew, do you mind if I jump quickly? I had a couple of things just on the back of that to add, specific, I think, to complexity, but I think that was probably kind of read into it. I just had a couple of visual things that I was thinking of here, because like with the as with the 3D representation of Cynefin that I worked on with Rob England and Martin Berg, I find pulling these things into a visual space, especially something that's three-dimensional, is really helpful for pulling it into the real world instead of this abstract two-dimensional model that then people say it's a model and it's wrong and it just goes. And that's where the loop, if you look at Cynefin as this two-dimensional model, there's a loop there as well, which people think is just a loop. And of course, when you look at it in 3 dimensions, you can see the energy transfers between all the different states, and they're very different. And you see where, the apparatic kind of area it gets involved. So I like the idea. I love the idea of the spiral. This shouldn't be a direct map, but I just want to throw it out there. If you look at Cynefin in 3D, like the model, the spiral actually would have to go up and down, right? Because complexity is a lower energy state than chaos. It doesn't go down, 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 down. It goes down, 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 up a bit, back down, kind of thing. So you've got that kind of flow very often, not always. But the other thing as well with the OODA as DNA, OODA's in your DNA. I don't know, there's another name you can throw in there. I think the idea of all the helical kind of construction is really good, because you've then got the option of these context or phase shifts. Maybe there's a way to map triggers or phase shifts as jumping between the different helical structures, which I think is really, really interesting. So that's where, and the first thing I was going to say right back at the beginning was when we were saying, what are we defining OODA as, this spiral? To me, I don't call it a framework. I don't call anything. Cynefin I see more as a lens. OODA I see more as a journey, and you just happen to step into it at whichever point. And the last thing I wanted to throw out there, I'm not giving any answers here, I'm just throwing random stuff out. I've been reading a lot of, Asimov and a lot of sci-fi. It's one of the things I do. So what happens if all the helixes connect at the other end, and that's your loop, rather than this being your loop, looking at it dead on, the kinky loop, rather than that? What if the actual spiral itself is looped? Just thought, I'm just thinking visually tonight because I'm too tired to actually use words.
That's wormholes with OODA.
Yeah,
pretty much.
Well, I mean,
Ben, your head was exploding and Ponch was getting excited. So I don't know who wants to follow that. My brain now hurt.
This is what I would do: is take the 3 colors of either understand, decide, and act, or however you break up the OODA loop, put them into what we have in the triple helix map. I hate to say map it out, but then I would make the sense making loop, if you want to call it that, really tight, depending on your context, and decide a little bit looser and act not as frequently, right? Not as frequent. And that may change. And this connects back to what Christopher was saying. So there's something that I think we need to amplify and work on, and get some bigger brains in here, like Dave, to go, how does this really work? You know, how do we make this work? But I think this is the right path. Everything that was said in the last 20 minutes or so has triggered something here in my head where I'm like, man, we're going down the right path. This is pretty fantastic. What's next? How do we do it?
I'm going to be watching this video over and over again just to learn what you guys just said. I'm sure Andrew's going to join me in that.
So will I, don't worry.
So, Ben, your head was sort of like, as soon as Chris was saying some things, you were like, boom. What was coming to mind there? Anything that you can share now in your thought process?
Yeah, it's this idea of jumping between energy levels, right? So now I think we're starting to bring in Kahneman's type 1, type 2 thinking. So type 2 thinking is high energy. You're and the other thing was, which is actually related to this, bizarrely enough, this is getting very, very kinky now. So we've got the idea of jumping between energy levels of decision making, right? So you've got the easy to make decisions of things that you're familiar with, that you know how to do, that are rote, that are muscle memory. And then you've got the higher energy of changing your orientation, so breaking down your internal structure and rebuilding it. So that's a high energy type 2 kind of thinking aspect. And then this notion of circling back on ourselves. So this is there's a bit of Hofstadter in here, which is Hofstadter's strange loops, which are these recursive hierarchical structures where going up the structure gets you back to where you started. And that's, you know, that's in the context of cognition as well. Like Hofstadter's, I've never got through Gödel, Escher and back, but there's these hierarchical recursive structures that you get through it and you're back where you started, but in a slightly different place. So you've almost got a helix, but it turns back on itself when you get to the end.
So Chris just put Andrew put it in, which was okay. So it was looking, it was about 3D models, but Chris put in it's Escher and the Goblin King in Labyrinth. So that was sort of a reference there. And but the 3D, so when people watch this, I will be adding the images in, so the 3D model of Cynefin, the diagrams from the book, and some of the conversations we're having, and the diagrams we've been referencing, especially when Ben's done some scribbling with everybody's participation. I'll add them to the video in post-production so people can see some of these things we're talking about. But there's a couple of things I want to bring in. I just want to ask, because I'm a simpler guy, and I think at a later time, maybe when we've had another session or two and actually got some sort of cognition, some sort of alignment on the theories here, then we can bring Dave in and see if Ponch can get Chet in, and then sort of say, hey, we got these ideas, what do you think? And then we can just watch for 50 minutes and see what they think. But Ponch, when you were thinking about this, when you drew the diagrams that went in the book, or you did the sketching at the workshop you did with Dave and others, and then we sort of had them, drawn nicely for the book, it seemed that you were looking at that within the different, when you're looking at the different domains of Cynefin, not when we went in the middle, you didn't do anything in the middle, although you can probably talk about that. But some of the things you were talking about, the different starting points, we've got this timeline, this spiral of time we're talking about, but depending on our context, depending on the situation we perceive we're in, whether it's chaotic or complex, etc., you was already starting to talk about the different points that we start in OODA to actually execute at that level. But I want to loop that, let me just finish. I want to loop that to a little bit what Ben was saying about this whole idea of orientation. Because if are we saying it all starts with orientation? Because I know with the drawings that you proposed, you can start saying we start with acting, which is what Ben had said earlier on, but then we're trying to converge back on orientation. So I just wanted to try and expand on that a little bit and your thoughts on what you put in the book.
Yeah. So the big picture, the way we came about that was working on a safety incident within the U.S. Navy, just having a conversation with some other knuckleheads like me, and we walked through the whole situation. I think it was a parachute jump, Navy SEALs and some frogs jumping, or some Army specialists jumping together, and they didn't do an effective briefing and all that. Anyway, we looked at all the components of that accident, and that's how we got to that drawing, or those drawings, the 4 different domains there out of the 5. The 5th domain is simple. It's just me going through the whole OODA loop. If you're going through the entire OODA loop, then you're probably confused, right? And that's what enemies and your competitors want you to do. Is if you're going through that, you're talking about high energy. You're spending a lot of energy trying to go through the whole loop. And going back to Ben's point of system 1 and system 2, we want system 1 type approaches, low energy approach, high impact, just based off of human nature. And in fact, before we go any further, this whole conversation, I'm looking at the strategic game of question mark and question mark, which is one of Boyd's briefs. The question marks are interaction and isolation. And the major influences on him at that time were human nature, neurons, complexity in the human brain, biology, psychology, anthropology. So about 1987, that's where he was thinking about everything that we're talking about here. So well ahead of his time. A lot we can do with what he gave us, so very, very excited to be talking about it. Sorry to take a little sidebar there. But back to your point, Nigel, it is a snapshot of what was going on in accidents at that time. And it helped us make sense of, I'm going to throw something else at you, human factors accident classification system, to see if that's still valid or invalid. And at that point, we were trying to get the Navy to move away from that. And that's looking at causal factors, or a root cause in accidents. And we're saying, hey, there's no single root cause in an accident. There's causal factors. There's many interdependent things going on there. So that was the nature of that whole idea, was a safety approach to thinking about the OODA loop.
So I want to bring the complexity experts back in. So I'm talking about Kim and Andrew, because I know for the viewers it's extremely early in Australia at the moment, and Andrew is suffering the fact that it's early morning. Bless him, he looks great. But from what you were saying, when I read what you created as part of the co-authorship of the book and the work we did on the flow system, it appears that depending on where you are, you shorten the loop, or you only use parts of it, which again gets away from it's a circular sort of BDCA type thing. And I guess that's what you were driving at, because certain things are very rapid, simple decisions and actions, and you don't need to sort of do this whole processing, because as you say, then you end up in an apparetic sort of confused state when you're trying to do that. I just want to validate that and then toss it over to the complexity folks on the team.
Right. So more into this, hopefully I say this right, the autonomic response. If you think about how that happens, that we can go back and forth and say, yeah, orientation is first or observations first. They're really tightly coupled. So Boyd actually wanted to call it the SOTA loop, the sense, orient, decide, act loop first, but he said that was ridiculous. So observation and orientation are tightly coupled, right? They have to be. So does it matter where it starts first? I don't think so. However, if you are in a clear domain, you have previous experience, you think about algorithms, things like that, you see something, it hits some part of your brain and you just react to it. Maybe that's the way it works, if that's how our biology set. Another example is biomimicry on an aircraft. They'll paint the bottom side of an aircraft with a canopy, and what that does, when it's at a certain distance, we can't tell if it's wings up to us or wings down to us. And what that does, it slows down our sense-making capability. We have to think, well, what am I actually seeing? So you're going to go through more of the sense-making loop there than anything. So again, it's context dependent, but within the orientation step of the OODA loop, you have previous experience in their genetic heritage, cultural traditions, synthesis analysis, and one other that escapes me at the moment. But humanness is right in the center of the orientation step.
Chris, Andrew, Kim. Andrew.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit slow this morning, but this is really interesting. And where I immediately start going with this stuff is, okay, so how do I take this into organizations and start to think about it? And I suppose what I'm immediately drawn to is the idea that there are the tightness of the cycles. If you think about the kinky loops as Kim described them, the tightness of those cycles is going to be very different depending on industry and depending on the problem domain. So I think of the example, I think it was Expedia, who was so good at that at the delivery cycle that not only were they able to continuously deliver products and services, but they were actually actively monitoring what their competitors were doing with their tests and targeting and their multivariate testing. So they're actually picking up signals that hadn't even hit the market from their competitors, and then acting on those in their product development. So like that, Expedia is a really good example. Digital product, hyper competitive industry, really short cycles where you need to get really good at just the decide, act, and you haven't got time to go through a longer cycle. But then you've got industries where I suppose the gap between the action and the outcome is a lot longer. So if I start thinking about utilities, where like I have to put a fair bit of work into understanding where generation capabilities, where generation is required. And then there's a long cycle between when I decide to do that and when I've actually got that capacity. And in between there, you can have regulatory, like a change from Trump to Biden in the States is a massive regulatory environmental change for a utility over there. And that makes me think that there's even within the context of organization, you've got lots of different cycles of lots of different length that you're trying to manage at an executive level.
You know, I know you're going to come in, Ken. I'm just going to read something that Brian was writing in the chat. He says, in organizations, from observation, teams and leaders tend to favor the decision-making over sense-making. And that's a cognitive bias called action bias. You've got to be seen to act. Even if you don't do the right thing, just act. And we do need to get away from that. We do need to get into sense-making. A lot of what Andrew was saying is clearly in that sense-making domain. Kim.
So that statement's actually a perfect intro for the little story I wanted to tell. So the little story is this. I was in a project meeting and there was a series of decisions that needed to be made and areas that needed to be explored. But the project manager was one of those really strong project managers. And he just went in and made a decision. And the picture in my head is he basically pulled a thing out of the complex domain and just set it in stone into complicated, right? That's what he actually did. And I hadn't ever seen it in that light before. So as humans, we can just go and prematurely make a decision, and the risk is it could be wrong. Now, if it's right, it's a perfect thing because you've actually got started. But then the other thing I was thinking of with our spirals and so forth and the interconnection, when you're exploring a complex domain, and this is also related to the speed, there are two different types of loops that we're going through, because exploring complexity requires us to do things like surface assumptions and test those assumptions and validate those assumptions. So if we take that exploration activity, we can go through the OODA loop of that fairly quickly because we're going, oh, let's observe and orient around what it is we want to explore. Let's decide how we're going to explore it. Let's take the action of exploring and see what we learn. And it's a bit like, I don't know what those long gears are called, but it's like there's this little gear that's the exploratory gear, turning the much slower gear, which is about us starting to see the patterns that are emerging in complexity. So it's like the two helixes are interacting at different speeds. And then that's what I'm saying. So the OODA loop about what to do, what actual action to take in the complex domain has to wait until we've done enough of the exploratory gears as well. So that's kind of this, and that's to help us avoid taking that premature decision to chuck it straight into the complicated domain and just get going.
I love that. That's like a worm gear, but what you're describing. But the whole thing about this triple helix thing we did in the flow system is about the interconnected, interrelated nature of things, and you just described that eloquently. So maybe we got something right. I want to throw something in here because, I started life as a lean guy, then went and did some stuff wandering the world doing this agile thing, and then sort of realized there was a problem, and then went and did this thing with clever people and sort of pulled something out of a hat. So back to this whole idea, because you were talking a lot of orientation there when you were speaking, Kim, and Ben had talked about everything's coming back to the and I've actually got the title for this video, and by the time people watch it, episode 2, the kinky loops. So that's going to be the title. That's so it's like, because you keep talking about it. But I'm going to throw something in here. So inductive, deductive, and abductive reasoning.
I was going to
okay,
mention
so I got a sort of an okay from Chris. So he's going where I'm going. So orientation is continuously moving between these different types of reasoning. So deductive reasoning is facts, things you're reading your dials, you're seeing something that's actually confirmed. That's a fact. So you're deducing what to do next as your hypothesis, because we talked about constantly creating hypothesis. Then when you've got inductive reasoning, you're making observations. Now, as a lean guy, I walk around a factory and I see things happening. I make some observations and form a hypothesis. Then I go carry out some experiment to sort of prove some idea. But again, in this sort of this orient stage, you're observing, and Ponch was a pilot. I'm not sure what Ben was doing, because he's got this great sort of Twitter handle, but I'm sure it was something military wise. We know Chris is sort of, a dangerous martial artist. But we know Ponch used to fly these high-speed jets off carriers, which is pretty scary stuff for normal folk. And inductive reasoning would have been in his mind continuously, because it's all observation, a lot of this thing. But then you got abductive reasoning. You're in cloud, shit's happening, and you don't know what to do. So you make some guesses or some assumptions. Now you're doing abductive reasoning. But all this is forming rapid hypothesis at one part of executing the OODA loop. And I wanted to throw that in there because a lot of that comes out of, lean teaching and stuff that I teach day to day. But this becomes really fascinating because we're bringing all these different areas together. And I just wonder what your thoughts were on that, because now I'm running out of things that's intelligent to say.
Could I tie what you just said back to what Andrew said? So there was a couple of things that this is actually perfect. So the Expedia example, right? Expedia have figured out how to operate in an extremely complex domain, and they've figured out how to operate at a higher level than all of their competitors, or most of their competitors, I guess, right? So they have greater fidelity of observation because they've built up a sense of what's going on. They've done that by taking some of their execution capability and turning it into internal structure and internal kind of abstractions, if you want, right? So they can sense make at a higher fidelity because they've spent some of their energy on being able to turn that into higher level reasoning, I guess is the best way I can put it. So they kind of built their fluency of operations, right? If you were going up against Expedia as a tech company now, you could take all of the systems that they had, you could take all of the technologies that they had, and unless you had that fluency of communication and operation, you'd be nowhere, right? You'd be building wicker planes on an airfield on a Pacific island, right? You would be nowhere. The same with the environmental change you mentioned in the energy companies, that it's entirely possible that there are other energy companies out there that have figured out that regime change is a thing and been able to project forward in time. This is, the third phase of situational awareness, which it probably has some tie back into this kind of different types of reasoning. It's an entirely possible scenario that you would have been able to think about the different ways that the regulatory regime, the regulatory environment would have changed and how that would have affected you, and have come up with some, actions on, we used to call it in the military, right? If this happens, this is our most possible, most likely cause of action, right? So you've got a high energy change in the environment, but you've got a low energy way of reacting to it and moving forward straight away, right? So it's drills. So I wonder how that, we've got the enhanced sort of sense making and fluency and you know, being able to sense your environment better with Expedia. You've got the potential of doing that in this kind of highly changeable environmental situation. I wonder how that fits with the deductive, inductive, and abductive reasoning. Where do those fit in those different domains is probably a word I'm going to get in trouble for, but I've had a couple of gins. I'm going to let myself off.
Areas.
Yeah, go ahead. Follow that, Chris.
I was just going to, if I could just add on to the abductive part. What I find interesting as well is the abductive part also adds the things we can't even conceive of. So no matter how many drills you learn, no matter how many, you know, scenarios you think of, no matter how many low probability, high impact events that you're black swans you're going to be looking at, the fact is that some of them are probably going to be medium or more, and you just can't see them, and you can't even think of them. So that's where the drill thing falls down. And obviously I've not been in the military, you can tell by the length of my hair, but
But you know, drills from martial arts. So you know,
drills from martial arts, but the drilling itself is creating neural pathways and you know, autonomous functionality, if you like, that's allowing you to, even if you're thrown off, and you will be thrown off when these things happen, to re-establish new drills that deal with a new situation much more quickly than people who aren't used to drilling. So even though the drills aren't maybe apposite for that particular context, you're going to be able to re-establish drills for that, for new contexts. And the second thing I just wanted to kind of add into that are the ideas of agility, not capital A agile, but agility, where you have, I define it in three ways. Agility and resilience I see as two sides of the same coin. This is very, very rough, so don't take this as gospel. With agility, you have the ability to change, to repurpose, or to respond, or adapt, accept, react. And I'm aware reaction is a reflexive thing, whereas a response is usually a choice, but we'll leave that for the moment. And then you have the resilience part, which is saying weak signal detection, which we kind of mentioned earlier, where you can try to avoid what you define as failure, which may not necessarily be failure, of course, but if you can't, you then you recover from it as quickly as possible. And that's where this drilling thing maybe comes in. And then you try to exploit the new paradigm quicker than anyone else, hopefully. So that's something I wanted to add into the spirals there.
Just on that, Chris, before we other people pick up on that, you do martial arts, so you're very familiar with kata. So these, well, you're familiar with what it is, even if you don't practice it. And I know we mentioned that a little bit last time, but is not a kata a form of drill? But then you get into this space where you can practice kata endlessly, and somebody can come and attack you with an iron bar, and it's useless to you. So is that not the same sort of parallel that you're talking about here?
It can actually be inhibitive. If you've trained too much in one way of doing something, and somebody comes with a completely different context, you're stuck in the reactions that you have. So kata in a class, one of the examples I love is from when I did Shaolin Kung Fu a long time ago. Now I can't remember any of it, but a lot of the movements in it are these very flowing, beautiful movements, which, you know, they kind of identify with Wing Chun. You've got your Tai Chi movements in there as well, and they're great. But one of the problems with it is they're not necessarily applicable in a way that BJJ or Greco-Roman wrestling is, right? Because that's very much there in the real world. They were designed like that specifically, apart from, I think it was Baji, Bagua, and Pigua, which were three of the oldest forms of Kung Fu. And they were designed like that so that any student of another master watching couldn't work out what it was for. So great on one hand, but on the other hand, actually quite inhibitive to not getting your backside handed to you in certain scenarios. So I just thought that was an interesting.
Because I'm sorry because you're triggering things with me from the PDCA mindset. Yeah, and I've got some theories about PDCAs, and that PDCA is not a closed system. That's for another conversation another time, and I can expand on that later. But PDCA becomes this discipline. Scrum is this standardized, repeatable process, this discipline, which is basically PDCA with a few bells and whistles. So, but what we're saying is if we get, pardon?
Six Sigma as well. They've incorporated the idea of
the DMAC loop, everything. Yeah.
You know?
So what happens? You get so in this obsession of this drill you're executing. When something crops up and goes like, you know, a scary clown pops out of a box, you go, oh, what do I do? Because PDCA and DMAC and all these sort of standardized, repeatable process can't cope with uneven workflow or sudden surprises or things that were unplanned or unpredictable. So once you move into complexity or anything that's unpredictable, these standardized processes don't work anymore. It's a real devil's own job trying to teach agilists this, I mean, this stuff doesn't work, and lean folk.
Can I add one tiny thing to that as well? You haven't just got that battle, you've also got the additional battle of sunk cost fallacy, where people have started believing this as a religious methodology. So even if they do get to the point where they can react, they refuse to, because they insist it has to be done another way.
So that's love aversion bias as well. This whole I will not give up what I've invested so much in, even though I know it's stupid. I will not give it up, which is, as you say, the sunk cost fallacy. It sort of plays into that. Kim, Andrew, we all went off on a bit of an exciting rage there.
I'm actually just getting drawn back to the conversations we were having earlier, Nigel, around adaptive capacity in organizations. I think Sonia was leading those. And the other thing that came up as we were talking was Jay Bloom's work on the 3 economies. So he talks about there being 3 economies in an organization, which kind of makes sense to me. There's things that you need to do really well, like you need to have operational excellence, you need to be able to do things cheaply, efficiently, high quality, and repeatable, of a repeatable nature. But then you've also got aspects of organizations where you're trying to introduce novelty, which is a completely kind of different action logic, which requires a different operating model and a different way to think about things. And then he talks about a kind of a clutch between those 2 systems, which is the economy of scope, which is basically, I think if you look at team topologies, it's the idea of the enabling team that brings novelty into established or operational knowledge. I kind of think there's something in that that's worth thinking about as well.
I think we need to bring Jabe and Sonia and Matthew Skelton back and sort of bring all their knowledge in, and bring Matthew's book Team Topologies in one of those. Kim, you were going to join in there.
Yeah, I was going to go back to the idea of drills. So to me, the idea of drills are to respond to something like a chaotic event. So I've always explained drills as, what do firemen do when there's no fires? Well, they practice putting out different types of fires. And I was, very interested to learn, when you've got a shed fire, you don't try, throw water on it straight away, because quite often you've got a lawnmower in there with a alloy engine, and once you've got something like molten magnesium or whatever, you chuck water on it, you get an explosion, right? So it's all those things. So I always saw drills as little actions like katas that people have practiced together that can be flexibly clicked together in different ways to respond to an unexpected event, right? So I think where things go wrong is when people try and apply drills in the wrong domain. You don't need to use drills in the clear domain, right? Because you've got one best practice and you can just follow the process. That's all good. You need drills to be able to respond to chaotic events. And if you try and use a drill process to explore complexity, you're probably going to get a very bad outcome, because you've got things that were designed to take action first, not to explore or orient or observe first. So that's kind of how I always thought of drills.
It's interesting, because Chris was right when you were saying that this is where crews have perhaps different applicability to teams. And of course, Ponch has taught me in the past about crew concept, and I'm sure that Ben and others know about this anyway, because, and then you were talking about these little sort of katas, these little sort of drills, and everybody's involved, which doesn't tend to happen in a lot of teams, a lot of organizations. This everybody's involved and everything seems to be a big drill and gigantic thing. I don't know if anybody's got any comments on that or on the crew concept as well.
Yeah, for me, the commonality when you're working in any type of drilling situation is if you focus on I hate to say it, the teaming skills or crew skills, that's where you're going to make your money, right? And this is what we're trying to teach some of the energy companies right now is when you do have operational excellence and you learn how to do plan, brief, execute, debrief, and you understand how to do that well, bring that over to the innovation side and really start making, paying attention to making sense of the environment. And of course, your environment changes when you go from exploitation to exploration, but the teamwork still remains the same. Now in aviation, when we learned how to crew, this allowed us to do the basic repetitive stuff better. And it allowed us to do the novel things better than our competitors, right? And that's what we wanted, is we wanted to drill to a point where the teamwork became natural. It was a normal thing that we had a flattened organization. We can make decisions. We can all contribute. We'd have distributed leadership. Sounds familiar, right? And we could really accelerate. And this is what I'm trying to do with the oil company that I'm working with, the energy company I'm working with right now, is getting to see that your people are pretty much the same no matter where they are. You know, they need to learn how to work together. They need to overcome their orientation with different tools and techniques. They need to have an operational, an OE moment, operational excellence moment, or a trigger, as we call it inside of complexity thinking or anthro-complexity thinking. And then definitely open it up, leverage the intent of the leadership. What are we trying to do? That intent, that the direction of travel we want to go. And of course, leverage multiple perspectives using different techniques, including red teaming techniques, complex facilitation techniques, whatever we need to do to rapidly get the best quality information out there. And I think that's the best we can do right now. And that's really about improving the team OODA loop, right? Trying to find the most efficient way through the OODA loop for a team, moving it from system 2 to system 1 thinking. So that's my connection there. And what we're really trying to do with the organization right now is simplify these things so they can get it done with minimum effort. So I'll turn it back to you, Nigel.
Well, Ben was, I think Ben had got a whole flood of thoughts coming there. Go Ben, go.
So yeah, so I think we're starting to touch on the implicit guidance and control loop, the implicit, not loop, pathway through the OODA loop, right? We've got, you know, some of the stuff that Kim said and that Brian's built on is essentially about building intuition, using drills that are small, self-contained, to have this kind of, I'll come on to another sort of tangential idea in a minute, but to try and build this ability to work in the intuition or you know, thinking fast pathway. I'm glad you mentioned red team thinking, Brian, because you know, I've done a lot of work with Bryce and Marcus, and the kind of the big brainwave that I had when I was doing the red team thinking stuff was, it's moving more stuff into a system and away from a skill, right? If you've got all of your leadership centered around individual people who are skilled and those people leave, you're screwed. The military tends to do things the other way, I think. And you know, the military kind of, you know, mission command and the orders process and all of these things are a system into which you can slot leaders of variable skill levels and still have them be effective and have them learn how to be better leaders within that system. And I think the whole point of doing that is that your organizational implicit guidance and control pathways become stronger, like a, you know, like a neuronal connection that becomes stronger. If you've got this system for communication or leadership or decision making or sense making or whatever you want to call it, the system gets built, and then the individuals who comprise that system are free to, you know, be part of that or move on to it, and that has less of an impact over time. I think that's quite important. As you know, we see business cycles shortening, we see tenure decreasing of the time that people stay in companies. You know, companies nowadays are much more about the systems, I think, or need to become more about the systems in order to stay robust, rather than the individual skills of people in those companies.
Yeah, this is the heart of why I think we created the flow system, was to move from the frameworks and the platitudes to actually create the system, whatever it may be. And they're going to be different in every company, but if you have a system of understanding to support it, then the creation of this is going to be co-created with, you know, a flow system coach from whomever and the organization. And one of the things we did at Toyota, or one of the things that Nigel and I did, along with Roger and a few others, is we came up with a basic kata on how to do effective planning for teams, which really follows everything around the OODA loop. And then, of course, it connects to red teaming and psychological safety, as well as putting a feedback loop at the end. But it's just a simple thing to do. And when people see it now, they get really excited about it, and they start to see the depth of it. And they go, okay, there's more to it than just what you're showing us. And of course there is. And to me, that's a simple system we can put together for organizations. If they're going to do it, I don't know. I don't know if they're going to buy into it, because there are too many, charlatans out there selling people on ideas that they cook up in their basement and are great at marketing. But once we overcome this, and I think we're going to see more things that look like crews, a ritualized form of a team, as you pointed out, because many organizations are losing people as they skip to job, and that's just the nature and the context we're in right now, the environment we're in. So I think what you're seeing, Ben, and what I'm seeing are very aligned based on our experience. And I've seen guys like Gareth Mock run in and take a red teaming course. I'm like, dude, I showed you how to do this a few years ago, man. You don't need to take a red teaming course to go do that, but I get it. So we're going to announce the red teaming course here from the Flow system, because I think that's what people want. Anyway, I'll throw it back to you, Nigel or Ben.
Well, Chris was putting quite a lot in the chat, and I want to give Kim and Andrew a chance. We're probably on the last 5 minutes of this. I just got one comment, because I try to make this easy for people like me to understand, and hopefully others that aren't, as because some of the brain waves today, the cognitive sort of thoughts here are incredible. But when we talk about implicit guidance control, let's just define what that means, because if something's explicit, it's stated plainly, it's stated clearly. If it's implied or if it's implicit, it's something that's implied but not stated implicitly. So it's not stated explicitly, it's just implied and not stated directly is what I'm trying to say. So when we talk about implicit guidance control, we're talking about, human sense and just sort of like, just that sort of, like tying your shoelaces, just habitually, you just know what to do. You get the rights that, the right cognition to do things, because there's no explicit do this, followed by that, followed by the other, which is more the sort of, drills and katas and that type of thing. This is just instinct was the word I'm searching for. So is implicit guidance control instinct, or is it something else?
I know I've been talking a lot, but I'll just say one thing and then I'll shut up. I think implicit guidance and control is abstraction. It's a method of chunking. So you've got tying the shoelaces is a great example, right? You don't think about, I'm going to, take this thing and hold it between these two fingers and I'm going to blah, 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 right? It's just a thing that happens because it's an abstraction. It's a skill. So there's a great podcast I listened to on Jim Rutt's show with Zach Stein, I think his name was. He was talking about horizontal versus vertical complexity. And implicit guidance and control is chunking up skills into vertical complexity. So things that you can use to compress how you do something. So it's becoming more familiar, it's becoming muscle memory. And that for me is what at least the implicit guidance and control line from orient to action is. The one from, it's a shame they're called the same thing, because the one from orient to observation is very different in my view. But yeah, for me, it's chunking things up in an abstraction that you can use as a chunk without having to think about the bits, like how you clean your teeth, right? You don't think, I'm going to clean this tooth and then this tooth and this tooth. It's chunked up as a behavior of, I clean my teeth.
So I'm going to move across my screen so everybody gets the last words, because you and Ponch have been busy. And Chris, you just put something in the chat saying muscle memory. Is that how you would describe that instinctiveness, or that the brushing teeth, tying your shoelaces thing?
Well, that was Brian who put that in.
Oh, was it? I'm sorry. I thought it was you. All right. Well, what's your thoughts on what's just been typed and said about the implicit guidance control?
Yeah, I've been making a few notes just thinking about it. I think it's interesting looking at the idea of, the horizontal versus the vertical. What was coming to mind when I was hearing about this and we were thinking about instinct, and you're looking back at first fit mental patterns and all that kind of thing, is that for me, I realized a long time ago that instinct is probably, and I did a little research on this, I need to do a bit more, but probably where emotion it came from originally. Instincts probably beget emotions. So we tend to concentrate very much on the cognitive side with all of this, but of course there are other dimensions that we use as well. And in learning terms, you're talking about Bloom's taxonomy, Krathwohl's taxonomy, which is the affective, and Harrow's taxonomy, which is the kinesthetic or conscious and unconscious physical, the psychomotor, if you want to call it that. So I didn't really have anything specific to say. It was just something that was going around in my very tired head after my little bit of sake. So, but yeah, I think that there's been some really interesting exploration. So thanks, everyone. It's been great.
I'll pass to Andrew, and then we'll let Kim wrap us, and then we'll talk about what we need to do before the next session. Andrew.
Yeah, I suppose where I was starting to think as Ben and Brian were talking there is kind of I think Dave calls it competence-induced failure, but the idea that you can get so good at something that becomes, this is how we always did it. And this is how
Apex predator theory, flexuous curves.
Yeah, and that creates risk in the organizational context as well, because this is how we always did it will work until it doesn't. And then there's a huge energy shift in order to kind of fix things. So I suppose part of turning this stuff into muscle memory is also turning the process of introducing novelty into your practices into muscle memory as well.
Wow, there was a lot of cool stuff you just said in that last 1 or 2 minutes. Kim, bring us home.
So I liked how we were talking about the spiral aspect and the thought that, you've got these potential 2-speed worm gears happening in the complex domain. And when we started to talk about drills, I thought of drills as very much your closed little ring, right? Because a drill is something that you just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And there's places where that's perfectly okay. But then the other picture in my head is I've got my lovely little worm gears turning in the complex domain. And if I chuck a ring in that, it's like throwing a spanner in the works. So that's sort of the picture that's starting to form in my head. You've got to be very careful if you try and use something from a drill type approach when you're trying to explore complexity.
And for the Americans, a spanner is a wrench. For the Brits, it means an idiot. But there you go. That's some British anecdotal stuff for later on. So that brings us to the end of this conversation. I think where I think we should take this, and yeah, the other team were chatting and said the rest of the team were just saying awesome analogy, Kim, and I absolutely agree. But I think we've got a lot of homework to do here to explore some of these ideas. I know Ben and Chris, you were furiously drawing, and I know Ponch, I know that face when he gets that face, his mind's now in this whir. So I think we need to sort of bring some of this together, maybe, refine some of those drawings that I know you've been playing with, and maybe put some of Chris's 3D visualization skills into that. And then come back in a couple of weeks, talk about that. We'll have the visuals to discuss and describe. Then I can see this sort of heading down. Let's get maybe Jabe, Sonia, Dave, Chet to sort of watch these videos and then bring them in for it. Yeah, exactly, Chris. Then bring them in for this annihilation, assassination, or this consolidation and alignment, whatever it might be, of all these ideas and thoughts, because the stuff you guys are talking about is even hard for me to consume. I mean, it's starting to get way up here for me, but it's fascinating stuff. And I'm going to watch this back and start doing a bit of the research on some of this, so I can say some more intelligent things, hopefully, or in things that are more intelligent next time we actually meet. So I'm going to stop the recording on this, and then we'll leave after that. Just bear with me 1 second.